Everyone. I did an analysis on P2 for Hackney Yard, and the information that I wanted to provide you everyone with um, was a lot. So a lot of it involves breaking down some team strategies or common strategies that are seen in the CDL on how to break this hill. And I didn't feel as if like a Twitter thread or all the different pictures I'd be able to provide you all with would kind of do it justice, and it would just kind of become a long, cluttered thread that nobody would pay attention to. I decided to do a very rudimentary video on this topic, and something that I hope teams, people, and anybody else who might be viewing this will find interesting and maybe learn something from it. So the first thing I looked at was kind of the Hackney Yard has P2, which is the second hill, which is kind of the I can just bring up an image of Hackney Yard or a video. So here right now we have Toronto Ultra versus Minnesota, and this is the first set of hill rotations, and they're on the first hill. So the first hill is in warehouse that we see here, right here. First hill is in warehouse that we see right here, and so I'll just let this play through. You did. Okay, so it is supposed to be on 1080. So I'll just let you play it through so you can get an idea. I turned the audio off because I know it'll drown me out. And you guys can see where Hill 2 is. Also, if for whatever reason Killa watches this, I loved your video where you broke down S&D strats and all that for one of the matches. One big tip is if you're using YouTube, you can hit the arrow keys to go forward 5 seconds or go backwards 5 seconds. So it'll help you when you're trying to scrub the footage and get to a certain area. So anyway, so this is where P2 is. First hill was on here, and then P2 is back on this side. This is a hard hill to break, as many people in the competitive community will know, mainly because unless you get kills to go in your favor, not many, the teams will continue to spawn around this hill and make it very hard for, very difficult for opposing teams to push them out of the space. So I'm assuming this is why it's a less favored map in play. So I'm just going to reset it to the timestamp that I want, and then I'll talk a little bit more about this. Because I just wanted to show P2. Anyway, so as you can see, here's all the different picks from hardpoint so far. Here's the times certain maps were picked. This may be inaccurate a little bit, so if you have the right information, by all means feel free to correct me. And this is the number of times the hills got played, so obviously there's 2 hardpoints per best of 5 series, and sometimes it doesn't go to map 4. So that's the reason why there's a discrepancy. And so I kind of tracked how often maps are also picked for map 2 by looking at this. So I also looked at which teams most consistently picked the hardpoints, or if there's a trend in those. So Hackney Yard was kind of all over the place, but I think it's more used for teams that feel as if they're strong sub-players, and then on top of it, as if they want to try, either they think that it's a map that they play well on, or that they do play well on, or it's a map that gets picked in order to throw off a team that they don't feel is prepared for it. Because obviously it's not being played very consistently. Also, Ramaza, you're probably looking at this one and kind of noticing the same idea. This is almost exclusively a London map. So if you look down here, we come over to London. London picked this 4 times, or was involved in a series where it was picked 4 times. I don't know the exact picks and vetoes for all the teams, but this is just what I noticed as a trend. London's played it a lot. I don't know specifically off the top of my head which is the other team, because there's Paris has played it twice, Dallas and Toronto have played it, and then New York has played it. I'd be willing to guess that it was probably Paris is the other one, because Paris seemed comfortable enough on the map to both keep up with Minnesota or with London on it, and seemed to want to play that map too. So I believe it's both the European team's favorite, which is interesting, but it makes sense because it's a very fluid map where you have both long AR sights and very submachine gun heavy portions of the map through mid map. So it makes sense that team with like player like Wooskins right now and a few others on that roster where it's very, very fast and hard hitting. At the same time, able to shut down long lanes of sight, along with Paris kind of having the same profile. Want to play a map like that, but the Hackney's kind of avoided just because there's the P2 hill, where it's a very money hill oriented, and technically P5 is a money hill too, but you don't see as much value in that one because teams rotate early from P5 in order to push through and start setting up spawns for P2, because if you get P2 early, you get the full hill time easily. And this is the average amount of time right here that teams will get if they show up to the hill early, which is not a lot if you're expecting that, but obviously every single team doesn't perform the same or consistently when rotating first. And this also does include teams that did get the hill broken and lost significant amounts of time, so that drags that number down. But I didn't run a metric for teams that don't get the hill broken and hold it for the full amount of time, but I'd be willing to guess it's like an average of 52 seconds. And then teams that do get the hill broken from them, or do break the hill and gain control, tends to get like 30 seconds off that hill time, which is really incredible. Another interesting thing is the Minnesota Rocker. Out of all the times that they experienced the P2 hill, they broke it 75% of the time. So there's like only 4 times it came up. They didn't rotate first for many of those. I think there's only 1 time where they did get first rotation, and out of that they broke it every single time they didn't get first rotation, which is pretty significant because not every team did that well, and most often teams didn't break it at all. But the amount of time that Minnesota got off breaks was actually pretty incredible, where they got like 42 seconds from the hill, which is mind-blowing, especially given how difficult the hill is to break, and then they were able to turn around and maintain it. So I'm going to break down kind of what they did in order to do that, because their setup, they executed it, they executed the break really, really well, obviously, given the amount of time that they had. But it is the setup that every single team's trying to perform whenever they go to break P2 on Hackney Yard. So we'll go ahead and jump right into that. I also have some other kind of standout instances here that I'm going to cover, which is why I didn't, make a lengthier video or make a Twitter thread instead of making this video. So the first example I wanted to cover is right here. This is, as I showed earlier, Minnesota versus Toronto Ultra. The thing that we want to look at first is kind of how the teams are set up. So there's 16 seconds left on the first hill. Rocker has 32 points. And right now, as we can see on the map, this is kind of a split kill feed, which is fine. It's normal. This is a scrappy hill, typically. And so we can look at where all the arrows for the teams are. So we have a player for Toronto here on this brick wall, cutting off this back alley, which is where Rocker should show up on respawn. You have a player top L, which is where they're just pinching the hill, and then you have somebody on scaffold helping pinch this hill, and then on top of it, securing the other half of the spawns for this hill, and then this should spawn Rocker out, so we can watch that play out. So there we go. We get a full wipe by Toronto, resetting the map for Minnesota. The other thing to mention is that there is a Minnesota player in top green position to make a play happen. So as I said, Minnesota spawned in backside of the hill since they got pushed out. So their main objective right now, they're trying to get positioned on the map to get to P2. And as you can see, Toronto is also already setting up. Toronto has 2 players just kind of grabbing the last bit of scrap time here. If I were them, I would be rotating Classic back in order to get him set up. Or I guess they're not going to. It's a better idea to have them here to try and make a play happen in warehouse, because this is going to be kind of the point where most of Minnesota's roster is going to be pushing through. So Minnesota gets a 3 wipe. The biggest one, probably the most important one here, is that Minnesota killed the player Methods back here. Assault got a kill from mid-map onto Methods, which then opens this space back up. So what this ends up doing is the Toronto players will end up spawning on the right side of this hill. So this makes it significantly easier, since Minnesota is just going to have to focus on the right side of this hill, which is exactly what they're wanting. So then they kill the guy on half wall, which is pretty huge, because now all of the Toronto pressure is gone from this half the map, which will allow them to get the perfect setup that they need. So now you kind of see this setup coming through. Cammy goes pretty big where he gets a couple kills, but I think we can let it run a little bit longer, and you'll see the setup start to take place. So we'll give it a couple seconds. So right now, basically what Minnesota is doing, they're piling up players right here in order to start to build pressure and get ready for the push. But what they're waiting for is somebody to be able to cut off the back spawns right here, which we'll see once these arrows come in and get into the space of the hill. So you have the 2 players from warehouse. They're gaining this space back, and then just queuing in to be able to continue pressuring the trades. And then the other Minnesota player is currently running to top office, where he'll have an angle to try and shoot and cut off the spawns on this side of the hill too. So the other big piece is that Minnesota has the player position now, and you have one cutting off into this space. And so what this space will do is, if the kills go in favor of Minnesota right here, then they're able to pressure in, which you already have Alex slaying out front hill. He's on the hill space, so it's technically Minnesota's hill right now. So then Toronto needs these kills to go in their favor if they want to maintain this hill. Otherwise, the game's recognizing this as Minnesota's hill. So the pinch is coming in where the Minnesota players are collapsing in onto the hill. You can see where the Toronto players is spawning in this back corner, and Minnesota's already set up to take this. They have somebody ready to slay close range, and then somebody in top office here, or top green, ready to provide the crossfire. Plus the Minnesota players are spawning in back here. So then now that Minnesota has hill control, this is going to be huge once Methods gets killed, because then Minnesota will start spawning Toronto out into the back half of warehouse and along here. Which happens, and then since Minnesota has presence mid-map, so this player right here, if they aren't positioned here, the Toronto respawn doesn't happen this far back. So they'll spawn warehouse, which you saw with Minnesota. So one thing that Toronto could have done different in order to prevent this break from happening is having a little bit more presence along these containers, and that would have forced Minnesota to spawn further out whenever they got killed. So this is kind of the end of the hill. Reason being is Toronto knows that if they, so we'll just let it run. Toronto has like one last push, but Minnesota once again has the spawns, and so they're completely set up. So this is kind of the ideal setup whenever you want to defend the hill, one guy on hill. And then usually teams have like two people right here, one person mid-map, and then one person here in order to provide crossfire. This kind of spreads out your spawns since this does kind of cut in half and spawns on both halves. So this is how Minnesota breaks the hill. This is kind of the ideal setup. The other thing that you'll see, which I think they play the setup better the second time around, so we'll skip forward. Yeah, so here's the playthrough. All the teams are set up. So we'll see how this plays out. So Minnesota actually gets the first rotation here. Okay, so it's one of their different maps where they have to do it. But basically, this is the perfect defense. The only difference is that Silly has the cross here, and you might want somebody up here in order to prevent, or in order to have like a longer range gunfight available to them. But they're forcing them to spawn really far back given their mid-map presence, and they have a lot of trade positions available to them that they'll definitely use. So that's what I want to discuss with Minnesota. The only difference is that when breaking it, they like to place 3 players down here, one guy on the head glitch right here, and then they have one person sprint in behind that guy. Usually, I believe it's either Assault or God or X that comes up here. And then that's what they use in order to kind of create the crossfire. They try and isolate the player here, kill them, and then flood in behind that and rotate one person back in order to cause the opposing team to spawn out. That's kind of your ideal setup to break the hill. The other thing that I wanted to cover was New York does another scenario to break this hill. This one was kind of more of a panicked push, but ended up working out. Or I guess this is Dallas versus London. I jumped the gun. So Dallas versus London, this is interesting. This is just another scenario that I felt was necessary to cover in order to fully explain this hill. So what ends up happening in this situation is that right now, once I enlarge the screen, it's kind of hard to tell given the backdrop here, but gotta mute this. Actually, this kind of helps. I feel like it's way more visible now. So what ends up happening is Dallas respawns in right here, and then you have London flooding in right here. So when we fast forwarded a couple seconds, what ends up happening is this hill space is kind of divided down a center line, and you see both teams fight each other for that space, which is a very interesting scenario, and we'll see how Dallas plays it out. So Dallas clears out, but they're still spawning in, but then all of a sudden all of London's back here, so they still get spawns. So London spawns close, Dallas is spawning close. I don't know why that player spawned there, but he did. But then now the two have to fight from this angle. So we'll see how Dallas kind of approaches this situation. The reason why Dallas is stacking back here is because they know it's the closer spawn and they have it. So they're just trying to, they know as long as they're the ones owning this hill or gaining the points on the hill, they'll keep spawning back there. So it's in their favor just kind of pile back here. So if London tries to collapse in here, they can't out-trade them. So the big play here is once I get the kill feed to show up, you have the London players down here, so they're pretty much wiped aside from this one person here, and then they're all spawning warehouse. So what Dallas can do is spread out and take over this space, but instead they kind of recognize the situation and start trying to spawn London entirely out of the space. And the way they do that is you have Clayster kills Wuskin right here, and then the player right here has a pretty big one-on-one to take on, because if he gets this kill and manages to push through, London spawns out. So Hook wins the one-on-one against Dylan, and Rated is the only player on a hill between two Dallas players that are on opposite sides of him, so it's not very favorable for him to in this situation. So Rated gets eliminated. Dallas keeps control of the hill, and then because Hook has positioned himself in this area, pushed up into mid-map, it's starting to spawn London out. So then this player is completely isolated. And then since there's not enough pressure from London, Dallas just continues to spawn here. And so then Dallas eliminates the last London player here, and this space is basically entirely theirs, and they are set up for it. So that's how Dallas ends up winning this pretty unique, like 50-50 setup. They didn't do anything too like insane other than just hold on to the closer spawn and just pile drive their way through, and then having the one player push into mid-map, sat there and pushed the London spawns out. If London had sat more players back here, they probably would have consistently held the spawn or continued to spawn this back alley here behind green and been able to push better, and cut off mid-map, so like trap Dallas in that corner to contest the hill a bit more. The other thing I wanted to cover, this is actually New York versus London that I wanted to look at. There's actually two New York matches. New York kind of does two really unique things or shows off kind of unique ideas that New York exclusively is using on this. You'll see that both teams for this hill hadn't really used smokes yet. That's something I'll point out that New York does end up doing. So right now this is meant to be New York versus London, or at least my example that I have, so I'll go ahead and change that. So New York breaks P2 for the first set of hill rotations because, this is New York versus Paris. This is just like a pretty big flaw that I saw in Paris's gameplay against New York that I just wanted to point out for this hill. So New York breaks P2 on rotation 1 because Paris does not have the man top bricks to block spawns and cut off. So I'll just talk through this situation. It should be the next one. Yeah, it is. So here's the scenario as it's coming down. You have New York has been spawned out. Paris has spawns for next hill, and they're spread out across it, so they're ready for this push. And they do get it. So right here, this is the big gunfight that Attach loses. If Attach wins this gunfight, he could get spawns really close to hill for his team and make their lives much more easy, but obviously not every one-on-one is pretty... It's hard to win one-on-one, so I'm not blaming Attach for this. It's just how things worked out. But if he did, it would have created a lot of opportunity. So either way, it was like good on Zed that he won a pretty important gunfight for that. But Paris would have been able to turn around and likely kill Attach here. But here's where the mistake from Zed comes in. So instead of staying here, Paris rotates everybody down, which as they should, and start prepping for this hill. But then Zed, instead of staying here, pushes out and then pushes into this building. And so this, and Paris doesn't really commit people back here. So Zed kills accuracy and is in position, but he doesn't really know that there's the player back here, or if he does, he's running from them to stay alive. But he's providing some of the crossfire here, which is good. But what ends up happening is that Paris gets slayed out and nobody really picks up this right side, and London or New York ends up spawning in here. So we'll keep it running, keep it running, keep it running. So Zed ends up dying here, or comes close to it, but he ends up running away, which is fine. But then there's nobody. Paris gets slain out, and there's only one guy on the hill, so Paris should get these spawns. But if Zed hadn't pushed out here and instead committed to the fight, he could have been involved in a couple more kills, or he could have just anchored for his team and aided in anchoring and maintaining these spawns, which is kind of the big part where this hill broke apart for New York, or for Paris, which is why like Paris or New York ends up getting in the space, they cut off the other spawn, And since they already had players mid-map from this push, it spawns pairs out and leaves Dens in a 1v4, which is not very easy to play. So there he gets traded out, and then New York gets the rest of this hill time. The other interesting thing that New York ends up doing, this one's going to be a much more shorter thing, but these are kind of like the three main scenarios. So you have the kind of ideal setup and break that you see Minnesota do, and they do that so cleanly compared to other teams. And then you have where the hill split like 50-50 in the case of Dallas versus London. And in this one, the two just kind of slug it out, but Dallas just focuses more on spawns, whereas London kind of focuses more on the kills and loses the spawn point for their team. And then in this one, just a small oversight by Paris. They don't keep an anchor in hill and end up losing that space and get team wiped. So just one of the other situations. This is just something I wanted to showcase that New York does. So the other thing that New York did was they smoke this space right here that you can't really see it in this setup, but it's what they do frequently, and none of the other teams really smoke in this area, or that I've seen, only in scrims that I've watched. But pause that. But we'll show it right here. So just to pause it, this is kind of scrappy. Let's see. Yeah. London ends up killing, or Dylan ends up killing 0, which is pretty huge. This opens up this right side spawn. And then you have one player working on getting the cutoffs, one player running to hill, because if London has the hill, then they'll continue to spawn on it. And then you have another one trying to play for mid-map in order to start working on slowing down that New York push. Which New York just kind of does like a 5-man flood onto hill and just overwhelms London. But the key factor, London actually just kind of separates out this hill, and they're able to do so successfully because here's the angle. So what they do is that they smoke this space right here, and what ends up happening is that Wuskin, who's trying to play the line of sight and the cutoff, he can't really do that. And then you have Zuma positioning himself to where he can play the close spawn right here and slay through. And then you have 0 also trying to do the same thing, but it cuts off the lines of sight, which is what smokes are supposed to do, and allows New York just to flood. And they do this a couple of different times on this map. Or not this one specifically, but when playing this hill on this map. So you'll see right here where they start to get hill control. Now it's a kind of a scrappy fight. They're starting to spawn on that hill since they do have this half of it. So they slay out, huge kill by accuracy. Wanting to make sure that, yeah, so here we go. So they know that they're going to keep spawning back here. Another thing that London does, I don't know if we'll see it here, no, is that they'll smoke the spawn point of the other team, so the other team can't even see what's going on and just has to rely on comms or getting out of that smoke. So then with Zuma's positioning in the kind of this corner, and they usually have somebody on this heady, they just have 2 people shooting down, and usually somebody on this crate. They usually have 2 people just shooting down, or however many, into this spawn as they have it completely smoked out, so the other team can't see them, but the second the other team walks out, they can just gun them down, which is really, really smart, not something that I saw other teams doing. So this is the kind of idea that I wanted to cover for the P2 hill on Hackney Yard. It's meant to be, or it's known as being a huge money hill, but these are kind of the teams that have figured out ways around it and have been using it to their advantage and both shutting them down, with Minnesota being the most efficient at breaking the hill and cashing out on it when they do break that hill. Minnesota, against the teams that they played so far, once again idealized or showed the ideal hill setup for that. So that's it for this video. I hope you find it interesting and that you learned some things. So until then, I shall talk to you all later. Goodbye.